It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and I was sitting at my kitchen table in Sudbury, Ontario, eating reheated beef stew and watching the frost settle on the backyard. The mortgage had been paid off 11 years ago. The truck was mine outright. I had a pension from 34 years with the municipality, a decent RRSP, and enough put away that I didn't lose sleep. I wasn't rich. I was comfortable. There's a difference, and I knew which side of that line I stood on. My son called me at 7:15. I remember because the news had just started. "Dad," he said, "Renata and I have been talking." That was always how it started with him lately. "Renata and I have been talking." As though every decision in his life now required a committee meeting with his fiancée before it could be announced to the rest of us. "We think it would be better," he said, "if you didn't come to the wedding." I turned the television off. I did it slowly, the way you do when you're buying yourself a second to make sure you heard what you think you heard. "Say that again," I said. "It's not personal, Dad. Renata's family is. They have a certain image they want for the day. Her parents are flying in guests from Montreal and Vancouver. Her father knows people. It's going to be photographed, and Renata feels that having you there might make things uncomfortable." I was 63 years old. I had spent 34 years fixing water mains and storm drains and frozen pipes in -30 weather, so my son could go to university, so he could wear a suit to work, so he could have the kind of life where he got to use phrases like, "Renata's family has a certain image." And now that image didn't include me. "Uncomfortable how?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. I could hear Renata in the background. Not words, just her presence coaching from the sidelines. "Just, Dad, you know how you are. You talk about work stuff, union stuff. You wear that jacket with the logo on it. The Sudbury jacket. It's a municipal worker's jacket, Dad. I know what it is. I bought it." There was a pause. Then he said, "We'll have you over for dinner after, once things settle down. Renata just needs this one day to go smoothly." I said I understood. I said good night. I hung up the phone and I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, until the stew was cold, and the frost outside had turned hard and the kitchen felt smaller than it ever had before. I thought about the day he was born. Queen Elizabeth Hospital, February. A snowstorm so bad the roads were closed, and I drove 40 minutes white-knuckling it through whiteouts because his mother couldn't wait. I thought about driving him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning for 6 years straight. I thought about the summer I took a second job doing weekend plumbing calls so we could cover his first year at Laurentian. I thought about helping him move into his first apartment in Toronto, the two of us carrying a mattress up 4 flights of stairs in August heat because the elevator was broken. I thought about Renata's parents, who had never once offered to contribute a single dollar to this wedding. That last part had been eating at me for months. My son had come to me in the spring, nervous, hat in hand, and told me the wedding was going to cost somewhere around $90,000. I had nearly choked on my coffee. $90,000 for one day. But he was my son, and I loved him, and I wrote the check. Not all at once, but in stages, as expenses came in. The venue deposit, the catering, the photographer, the flowers, the hotel room block for out-of-town guests. Renata's parents were wealthy by any reasonable measure. Her father ran a commercial real estate firm in Westmount. Her mother sat on 2 charity boards and wintered in Florida. They had contributed exactly nothing to the wedding. When I'd raised this with my son, gently just once, he'd gotten defensive and said it wasn't how Renata's family did things. I never asked again. I just kept writing the checks, and now I was being asked not to come. I didn't sleep well that night. I made myself tea around 2 in the morning and stood at the kitchen window looking at the street. The neighborhood was quiet, porch lights on, a cat crossing the road. Ordinary and decent, the way ordinary and decent things look at 2 in the morning when everything else feels upside down. I thought, he is my son. I love him. Maybe I should just accept this. Maybe Renata's world is just different, and I should be the bigger person and let them have their day. Then I thought about my wife. She had died 8 years ago, cancer, and her name was Bernadette, and she had loved that boy so completely and without condition that it still made my throat close to think about it. She had a pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, and a small oil painting. Nothing famous. just a landscape a local artist had done of Lake Ramsey, that she'd kept above the fireplace for 20 years. Those two things were the most valuable things she owned. She had told me, more than once, that they were to stay in the family. When she died, I kept them on the wall and in the jewelry box where she'd always kept them. I never moved them. I couldn't. 3 weeks after my son's phone call, I drove down to Toronto for a different reason. I had some paperwork to deal with, a property matter with a cousin, and I decided to stop in at my son's apartment while I was in the city. He'd given me a key 2 years earlier for emergencies. I'd never used it. I used it that day because I tried the buzzer 3 times and got no answer, and I needed to leave some documents I was holding for him. The apartment was empty. They were both at work. I set the documents on the kitchen counter, and then I noticed, the way you notice things when a space feels wrong, that something was different. I walked into the living room. The painting was gone. I had lent it to him. Lent it, not given it, when he moved in with Renata because he'd said the apartment felt bare and he loved that painting. He knew what it meant. He'd grown up under it. I stood there looking at the empty wall for a long moment. There was a clean rectangle in the paint where the frame had hung, lighter than the rest of the wall, the ghost of it. I opened the drawer in the side table where I'd seen Renata keep receipts and papers. I don't know what I was looking for. I think I already knew. I found a receipt from a consignment gallery on Queen Street West. The painting had been sold 6 weeks earlier for $1,200. There was a second receipt underneath it, from a jewelry reseller on Bloor Street. Bernadette's pearl necklace, $2,000 total. They had sold my wife's things for $2,000 and used the money toward, what? I found out later it was a down payment on new furniture for the wedding gift registry thank you party. A party. They sold Bernadette's things to pay for a party. I put the receipts back exactly where I found them. I straightened the drawer. I walked out of the apartment, locked the door behind me, drove to a Tim Hortons on Yonge Street, and sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes. I didn't cry. I was past that. I was somewhere quieter and colder than crying. I drove home to Sudbury that afternoon, 5 hours north on the 400, through Georgian Bay country, the rocks and the trees and the gray November sky. I had a lot of time to think. I thought about what I was going to do. The wedding was 6 weeks away. I had already paid, in total, just under $70,000 toward it. There were still outstanding amounts: the final catering invoice, the floristry balance, a transportation company that was handling the shuttle buses between the venue and the hotel. All of it was in my name. I had insisted on that, actually, back in the spring, because I was paying for it, and I wanted the paper trail to be mine. At the time, Renata had made a small face about it, said it was unusual, but my son had talked her around. I thought about that small face now, and I understood it differently. Over the next 2 weeks, I made some phone calls. I spoke to the catering company first. I explained that there had been a change in the family situation, and I needed to understand the cancellation policy. The woman I spoke to was professional and sympathetic. There was a cancellation window. If I notified them in writing within a certain time frame, a portion of the deposit was refundable, and the remaining balance would not be charged. I had the same conversation with the florist, the transportation company, and the venue coordinator. I then spoke to my bank, the joint account I had set up to manage wedding expenses. My son was a signatory, a convenience I'd arranged so he could pay vendors directly if I was unavailable. I reviewed what was in it and what was outstanding. Then I made some adjustments. I also called my financial advisor. There was a sum of money I had been planning to transfer to my son as a wedding gift. A significant sum. I told her to put it back into my own account. I did all of this quietly. I didn't call my son. I didn't send an email. I didn't warn anyone. I just worked through the list one call at a time, the same way I used to work through a repair ticket. Methodically, completely. No loose ends. There was one more thing. My son's truck. He'd had an incident 3 years earlier. Not his fault. Genuinely not his fault. A woman ran a red light and T-boned him, and his insurance had been steep ever since. I had been carrying him on my policy as a favor as a rider, because my clean record kept the premium manageable. It saved him about $200 a month. I called my insurance broker and removed him from the policy. I sent my son a text that evening. Short, I said. I've made some changes to the wedding arrangements. You'll want to call the vendors. Take care of yourself. Then I turned my phone off and went to bed. The next morning I turned it back on. I had 14 missed calls, 6 from my son, 4 from Renata's number, 2 from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Renata's mother, 1 from Renata's father, 1 from son again. There were text messages, long ones. The tone changed as they progressed, from confused to alarmed to angry to something approaching panic. The venue had contacted them because the cancellation notice had come through. The caterer had called, the florist. My son left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes. He started by saying there must have been a mistake. By the end he was crying. I listened to it once. I set the phone down on the counter. I put on my jacket and I drove to the Lido for breakfast, which is what I do on Fridays. I had 2 eggs over easy, rye toast and a large coffee. Hazel, who has been working the morning shift there for 12 years, asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. I was fine. The eggs were fine. The coffee was fine. Outside the window, Sudbury looked the way it always looks in November, gray and honest and not trying to be anything other than what it is. When I got home, there was a car in my driveway, my son's car. He was sitting in it. When he saw me pull up, he got out, and Renata got out of the passenger side, and I could see from the end of the driveway that he'd been crying for real, not for effect. His face was blotchy. He looked about 19 years old. I parked the truck and walked up to them. I didn't say anything. I waited. "Dad," he said. "Dad, what did you do?" "I canceled the arrangements," I said. "The ones that were in my name, everything is canceled." "The venue called us, the caterer. We can't. The wedding is in 6 weeks, Dad. I know when the wedding is." Renata was very still. She was looking at me differently than she ever had before. Not with contempt, with something more calculating. I had the feeling she was reassessing what she was dealing with. "You can't do this," she said. "This is our wedding. You don't have the right." "The contracts are in my name," I said. "The deposits were my money. I have every legal right." "You're going to ruin everything," she said, and her voice cracked. "Do you know how long I've been planning this? Do you know what this day means to me?" "I know what that painting meant to me," I said. "I know what that pearl necklace meant to me. They belonged to my wife. She's been gone 8 years, and those were the last things I had from her mother's side of the family. And you sold them." The silence that followed was of a very specific kind. The kind where the people you're talking to know they have no ground to stand on. That was, my son started. "Don't," I said. "Please don't explain it to me. I've already heard enough explanations." Renata's father called me that afternoon. He introduced himself as though I didn't know who he was, gave me his firm's name, used a tone that I expect works very well with the people he does business with. "I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding," he said. "There hasn't been a misunderstanding," I said. "There's been a pretty clear understanding, actually. That's the problem. My daughter has been planning this wedding for 2 years. Your daughter's wedding," I said, "has been almost entirely funded by a municipal retiree from Sudbury that you didn't consider suitable to attend. I'm curious how you've been thinking about that." A pause. "We would have been happy to contribute. You were never asked not to contribute," I said. The option was always there. It remained available for 18 months. The checks came from my account because nobody else was writing them. He tried a different approach. Reasonable man to reasonable man. The wedding could still happen, perhaps a smaller scale. Perhaps there was a way to reinstate some of the bookings. "Reinstate them how?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. I told him I wished his family well. I told him I hoped his daughter and my son could figure out their next steps together. And I told him that if they wanted to start over, with a wedding, with a family relationship, with any of it, they could come and talk to me. Not call me. Come and sit down at my kitchen table and have a real conversation. Then I hung up. My son came back on his own 3 days later, without Renata. He knocked on the door, which he never does, and I let him in. And we sat at the kitchen table with tea, and neither of us said much for a while. He looked exhausted. He told me Renata's parents had agreed to cover a scaled-down venue. A restaurant private room. 40 guests instead of 180. He told me Renata was furious at him, at me, at everyone, but that underneath the fury she was scared, and he was trying to hold things together. I listened to all of it. I shouldn't have called you, he said. About the wedding, telling you not to come. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I said it. She asked me to, and I didn't push back the way I should have. No, I said. You didn't. I don't know when I stopped. He stopped. He looked at his hands. I don't know when I stopped thinking about you the right way. You're my dad. I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm. He's 40 years old. But in that moment he looked like the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from hockey practice, chin against the window, completely trusting that I'd get him home. You're going to have to figure out your marriage, I said. That's between you and Renata, and I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I need you to know that I will not be invisible. I will not be hidden away because I'm inconvenient. Your mother worked double shifts at the hospital for years so we could give you a good start. I dug trenches in January for 34 years. We were never ashamed of any of it. You don't get to be ashamed of it either. He nodded. He didn't try to argue. And the painting, I said. And the necklace. He closed his eyes. I know. I didn't know she was going to. She said she was going to rearrange some things, redecorate a little. I didn't know what she sold. I swear to you I didn't know. I looked at him for a long time. I decided I believed him. That might have been the saddest part of all of it. You need to know what's happening in your own home, I said. That's not optional, I know. We talked for another 2 hours. About things we hadn't talked about in a long time. About his mother. About what she would have thought of all this. About what it meant to build something from nothing, which is what our family had always done. And what it cost. And why that cost wasn't something to be embarrassed about, but something to carry with you and understand. He helped me with the dishes before he left, the way he used to when he was a teenager. We didn't say much. It was enough. The wedding happened 6 weeks later, smaller and quieter, and at a restaurant in Mississauga that Renata's parents had reserved. I was there. My son had called me himself. No coaching, no committee meeting, and asked me to come. I wore my good suit, the dark navy one I'd bought for Bernadette's funeral and hadn't worn much since. I left the municipal jacket at home. Renata's father shook my hand when he saw me. Firm grip, direct eye contact. I'll give him that. Renata and I did not become close that day, and I won't pretend otherwise. But she looked at me at one point during dinner, and she said something I didn't expect. She said, I know I haven't been fair to you. She said it quietly, not for the table to hear. No, I agreed. You haven't. I nodded. I told her that was all I needed to hear. On the drive home, 3.5 hours north, the 400 at night, the Precambrian shield rising up on both sides of the highway, dark rock and dark trees and a half moon. I thought about Bernadette. I talked to her sometimes on long drives, not out loud. Just in my head. I told her how the day had gone. I told her the boy was going to be all right, I thought. I told her I was sorry about the painting, about the necklace, and that I was working on getting right with that loss. I passed the turnoff for Parry Sound and the highway opened up and the moon was bright enough to make the lakes shine through the trees. It was the kind of northern Ontario night that reminds you why you live where you live, even in the cold, even after everything. I drove on home.